Welcome to Leadership Bites with myself, your host, Guy Bloom. This is a leadership podcast where I have conversations with colleagues, I chat with guests, and sometimes there'll be just me talking. You can connect with me at livingbrave.com, and when you enjoy the episode, subscribe and please tell everyone. James, just fantastic to have you on this episode of Leadership Bites. Welcome.
Thank you very much. So thank you for inviting me.
Absolute pleasure, and we've been having a few conversations to get us here and just looking at diaries. I say this at the start of every episode, which is I know who you are. Great just to get an introduction from yourself.
Yeah, sure. So current day job is head of HR for what we call the Overseas Markets, Jaguar Land Rover. So that's all the sort of it's mostly our emerging markets. So it's South America, Asia Pac outside of China, Russia, India, all the bits of world outside of UK, Europe, America, and China, essentially. So a broad tapestry. Other things to know about me. I've been doing that kind of job for in career terms, a relatively short period of time. I spent 20 years in recruiting. My prior job was heading up talent acquisition for Jaguar Land Rover, and prior to that, I was head of leadership recruiting. And my old team would probably say that's sort of where my heart is and where my passion came from. So. And that kind of also drew me into the world of academia, really, because I was sort of looking at a lot of the problems and a lot of the sort of literature and traditional practices, even in recruiting, and kind of going like, there's something a bit wrong here. There's something missing. And when I was asking the people that you would typically ask for answers, I wasn't getting very good ones. So that kind of led me to explore more broadly and do some of my own learning independently.
Let's hop on that because it's something that we've spoken about, and I think it's very interesting. When somebody says, I felt something was missing, and then it leads them down a path of curiosity and investigation and into that academia space. Let's just start off with, that's a great background when you're doing recruitment as opposed to just development. I think that's very interesting that you have a line of sight on almost the raw materials just as much as you do potentially how to develop. So what was missing?
Well, it's interesting. We could probably start with that, right? Because if you look at the traditional methods for selection, they tend to come from a kind of causal mindset, right? Which is really positivistic, which in academia means that there's a relationship of cause and effect, and things are set. And actually, if you look at, for instance, the personality trait literature, that the sort of hardliners will tell you that personality is absolutely fixed. And then if you come at it from a developmental angle, that's a whole different school in psychology and the interact. And for me, as I read probably rather more than I should have done. There was a bridge between the two, and the better people who like Manfred Ketstervidz in SIAD, for instance, great writer, were able to kind of bridge multiple areas of psychology, and actually the developmentalist would say, look, there's a reasonable degree of flex in psychology, possibly up to 30%. And then you go into it further and you look at the competency literature, and you actually start to understand there's a conflation of identity, like who you think you are, what you think your personality is, and that ultimately drives behavior, which then drives outcomes. But it's pretty muddled within the literature, and then you have to kind of walk on a little bit. And then Jung, no one wants to talk about Jung because Jung sort of. He's pretty out there. I mean, Jordan Peterson, is so famous for saying that if you talked about Jung, it would be the end of your academic career. But actually, I've got tremendous respect for Jung, because for me, actually, what he landed on was the fact that some of these things are captured within the trait literature, right? So extroversion or introversion are actually ultimately polarities of psychology.
So he was talking about archetypes, right?
Well, yeah, but Myers-Briggs is based on Young, right? And arguably you could say one of the reasons it's got really poor test-retest validity is perhaps people are developing, right? And that's the sort of developmental journey. And for me, some of the better literature that I've orientated towards is actually behavioural flexibility. So, and the whole concept of behavioural flexibility is you need to kind of get to a point in order to be effective, that you can work with the opposite of your preference or where you've come from on your developmental journey, if that makes sense. Because if you look at the leadership literature, and if you're any kind of academic would say, even a positivist, right, with cause and effect, that study is bounded to that context, right? It's you've captured a result, but that's how it was in that context, and it may or may not be transferable to another. And that's where when it gets you're getting into far messier theories where fundamentally you have to be comfortable with greyness. And the more that you sort of see these theories, and theories are no more than a conceptual understanding of how the world is interacting, you see how messy it is. And and I can take you through some observations, but one of the most powerful ones is one of my networks, a partner McKinsey, he used to lead the org practice here, and I know he kind of shares this view that whatever an individual psychology is, right, as powerful an effect on that, right, is the context within which they're operating. Now, but there are elements of psychology that gives you greater resistance to context, if that makes sense. And I think if you look at the context that we're operating with at the minute, what has it been, right? I mean, it's certainly when I started writing about the relevance of leadership psychology in a volatile, uncertain, and ambiguous context. Trust me, this was pre-pandemic. This was like quite a few years ago now, and I always feel like I've manifested my kind of research, because the world, it seems like it's got so much more volatile and uncertain, and I think everyone's just hoping it might get a little bit less like that.
Just so I can make sure I'm keeping up with the main party, am I oversimplifying it? And the answer may be yes, you are. But am I oversimplifying it by saying, if we talk about type and trait, and saying that, look, there's a belief amongst some that there's a fixedness to individual characteristics, and then there's more that is a preference, which is more developmental, which is why some psychometrics are okay for recruitment and some are more almost on the catalytic conversational side.
Well, yeah, I mean, to be appropriate for recruitment, it would have to have test retest validity, right? So you'd have to be able to get the same result. Is it likely to be, predictive of that which you are looking for, right? And just because something's widely used doesn't mean that it's necessarily the best tool for the job. It just means that it's better known. Now, most things have a power law applied to them, right? Or the Pareto paradox, which means that which is used first tends to get used most, and it's just because it was first, right? That's the point. And look, don't get me wrong, there is, I'm a huge fan of psychometrics, both from a developmental standpoint and also from an assessment standpoint, primarily because they're, people are naturally biased, and if you don't think you are, that's probably not a good sign.
Well, that's your bias.
Well, yeah, if you're biased, you're not biased. So anything that you can do within the recruitment process to challenge bias is really, really helpful. And this is where you kind of but this is where you kind of start to head into some of the paradoxes, right? And one of the paradoxes is the constructs of leadership emergence, right? So getting into a leadership role are materially different from that which makes you effective. And I can sort of talk, in a little bit of detail around that. So if you look at the literature, you're going to see that generally speaking, extroversion is a better, predictor of leadership emergence than introversion. Openness to experience or curiosity is to a certain degree. Um, uh, Conscientiousness is, right. Predictor of emergence. Neuroticism isn't, and it all looks terribly rosy at that point, doesn't it? It's like, well, that's easy. We'll just assess for all of those things. But it's just not that simple, because then, what might be not quite so good about an extrovert? Well, if you're an extrovert, you're likely to be, and you're firmly rooted there, and you have no behavioural flexibility, and you haven't learned to moderate your natural preference, for instance. I am one, so know thyself. You're less likely to listen, right? And that's a tremendous impediment, particularly as you get to more senior levels of the organisation, where you're less likely to be told the truth. I mean, where there was that. I just watched The King recently, and there's a great line in that. It's like, a king doesn't have friends. He has only enemies and followers. And it's a little bit like that at senior levels of leadership, because you have power and people want something from you. So if you're not, good at listening and enabling, the psychological safety and being inclusive to allow what you're not hearing, you're ultimately going to be blind to anything other than your own perspective. That's again, that's not, might work in a certain context, but it's certainly not where you want to be all the time. Curiosity is another interesting one, and some of those profiles pretty high on that. But the downside of, I suspect one of the reasons it's not a bigger predictor of emergence is that you're less likely to accept leadership from above, because the underpinning desire that drives curiosity is intellectual independence, right? You're seeking freedom through intellect fundamentally. That's the driver that sits underneath it. But again, in today's world, where frankly, how you did things yesterday is far less relevant, it's really important to find out how things might be emerging, right? So leaders should be leading. That's where the whole leaders should be learners come from. So I mean, I can go on. I don't want to kind of hit you with loads of specificities, but you get my point.
A couple of things in that. I think one in particular is this idea around context, because if we said, for example, I am giving a direction because of context that is an emergency with a lack of knowledge or understanding of the answer from others, but actually I've ridden the horse before, therefore I'm being looked to furnish an answer, because actually without an answer there's going to be a failure point. It makes sense. But actually, of course, if I'm offering that directive to people that already know the answer or have opinion, so the context is, which I think can take somebody from being seen as having a position of authority to being authoritative.
But it's a continuum, isn't it? But if you look at all of these things, right? Conscientiousness. Similarly, certain relationships with elements of transformational leadership. But you take that too far, you can be, highly controlling. You can, push your team too hard, right? And again, in a context where, and I'm deliberately using kind of trait language, because I can get into other more developmental psychology language, just because people are going to be more familiar with it, and that's where I think some of these more traditional approaches and thinking are more problematic in a very high uncertain context, particularly when organizations are just massively lean. And one of the things that I've observed is, you can you can get away with a tremendous amount, right? There's, I think, for one of the rules of power, isn't it? Success forgives everything. you know, but and it's, I think Jeffrey Peffer said that, it's actually success. If you're actually successful, people will forgive you a tremendous amount. But the problem is, it's very difficult.
Or they'll tolerate. They'll tolerate
yeah.
an amazing amount. Forgiveness is one thing, but people then get tolerated for success when actually there shouldn't be a tolerance, right?
But when the wheels come off the bus, and that's the problem. I think there's a lot of wheels of a lot of buses at the minute. Actually, how you've treated people, and the degree to which you've been able to take with you. I mean, I think one of the there's a couple of nice leadership coaches. Leadership is a social process to achieve collective results, right? It's direction. Another one, direction, alignment, and commitment, right? You need all parts of that triangle, and people will follow you if you're leading successfully, right? But you can't get alignment unless you've kind of got IQ and EQ, if that makes sense. If you can't take people with you, equally, if you've got all EQ, but no go, you're not going to get commitment, because and equally, if you can't pace set to a reasonable degree, that isn't going to be role modeled, and that's one of the things that you can. It's just very different, and I've really enjoyed working for big companies. Is you sort of see the theory or the practice or whatever it might be, but then you see it play out in the organisation. It's like a kind of never-ending doctoral study because you're just in it. And that's one of the things I really enjoyed in sort of having one foot in academia and one foot in in the context I was operating with, because it was this never-ending
petri dish.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, with volatility being the consistent.
This curiosity led to this academic focus, which then obviously manifests due course into the operation. I mean, there's a broad brush of what you might be interested in. Usually when you're doing academia, there's a singular focus. So there's a dissertation or an output.
Yeah, sure.
Where did your focus go?
Yeah, so I was, I mean, I ended up stealing bits and bobs from developmental psychology fundamentally, but by far the most interesting element for me was different names, but cognitive complexity would be the one word for it. Ego development is another word for it, but fundamentally this is the sort of Piagetian development of personality and brain, if you like. I'm hesitating to say intelligence, but of course it is a form of intelligence. Over time, and the real, really messy aspect of it is, of course, and it's helpful if you understand it from a Jungian perspective, I think, is that the nature of your personal journey will kind of depend where you started from. But fundamentally, what's going on is there's an integration of your personality, and you're evolving through meaning-making stages, and integrating the world into a more complex through each stage of cognitive development. And if you understand that, then you don't need to be a rocket scientist to work out that what you really want is the more cognitively developed or behaviorally sophisticated people at the top of the organization, because they're going to be role modeling the behavior, or the psychology, which then drives the behaviors in a sufficiently nuanced and contextualized way that you need for a given context.
So we have different starting points.
Yeah.
Life happens to us.
Quite.
There are inputs into our development that are conscious or unconscious. And then at a certain point, that's developing or has developed into our ability to reflect, observe, seek feedback, seek counsel, and have an adaptive learning mindset to a greater or lesser degree, or not to, or to have a relatively fixed mindset. And there's something, if I'm hearing you correctly, that says it is that integration of self, of others, and that ability to take that on board and it not overwhelm or frighten us. We become more by the more we can understand and take in. Have I heard that correctly?
Yeah. So I mean, in terms of outcomes, you're correct. And how you get those outcomes in terms of change, you get it through feedback, through failure, typically, and more importantly, from admitting your failure and choosing to take it as a learning opportunity. And that's where kind of growth mindset, comes in. But equally, if I can come back to the point that I made in the beginning, which is actually how you're treated and the context that you're operating in is as important. And actually, if you look at Carol Dweck's study on mindset, that came from that her realization came from the point if you took two equal weighted groups of students, you treated one as geniuses and one as average or below average, what happened? Well, the geniuses ended up profiling as geniuses and vice versa. And yet that's why it's important that you learn to kind of fail forward, if you like, and choose to take a developmental attitude towards that. Get comfortable with the fact that you're not perfect, and essentially kind of grow from that. And there's a brilliant board. I'm sure I saw it outside of a coffee shop, but it was all the things that Abraham Lincoln had failed at. And it was this gloriously long, and funny enough, actually, resilience was one of the constructs I used from academic studies. Because if you're not just prepared to fail repeatedly, dust yourself down and get up and go again, but have the humility to kind of go like, yeah, okay, that was my bad. I take responsibility for that, and I'm going to do better next time. Then you're never going to grow.
And this is quite heavily into the martial arts, have been all my life. And one of the things I notice is that the people that get good are the ones that train with people that are better than they are. And they are in control. You have to very quickly, you learn very quickly, you get your ego handed to you. And anybody that can't master it and control it doesn't get training partners. Nobody wants to play. Because if it's all about you winning, then you're going to hurt people. You're going to try and dominate. You're not going to learn. It becomes an agreed, even though it can be quite serious because somebody's trying to do whatever they're trying to do to you, there's a level of vulnerability in the learning afterwards and that willingness to go, I know what's going to happen. I know I'm going to get beat, but I'm going to get beaten by an expert and I'm going to learn.
But who do you want to hang out with, right? You want to hang out with a guy that's highly proficient, right? So he's kind of, if you think about it from a leadership standpoint, maybe a master may have great functional and technical expertise, but fundamentally, I'm trying to find a polite word. They're not an idiot. Do you know what I mean? You want to hang out with them, so they have aspects of their humanity that they worked on as hard as their practical and technical skills.
And what's really interesting, especially in the modern age, is the practicality of traditional martial arts. And what you have is that recognition that, again, these things are very contextual and the experience of individuals. So I've been in the room sometimes with people who I'm technically more capable than, and I'm more proficient than and higher ranked than. But if we stepped outside, they'd stick me in the boot of their car and I'd never be seen again because there's a difference between... No, but for some people, right, because they're from that domain and I'm from this domain. And that's that interesting thing about that academic transfer. In the training room, it can be very intellectualized. It can be, it can look great on a flip chart. But in reality, right, it's different.
But also, like, how much do you want it, right? My thing was, well, this is interesting because it's associated with very low IQ motorbikes. But I'm at the point in my life I don't really care. If you go motorcycle racing, you absolutely want to be in the fastest qualifying group possible, and ideally with people that are loads better than you, because they will bring you on, because people come around the outside with a lean angle that you're just kind of going, how is that even happening, with kind of bits flying off, sparks flying off them, and that's how you learn, right? You learn by getting beaten. And it's
Yeah,
and
how
the
did they do?
really
How did they do that?
yeah and what's really interesting is the better they are, right? You know, very often the more benevolent they are. I mean, some of my best sort of learning experiences go from a guy called Jeremy McWilliams, who's sort of famously kind of beat I think he beat Rossi or something on a two-stroke, and incredibly benevolent, because like honestly, what am I to him, right? But but if there's ego involved, he might be kind of trying to compete with me or something. But actually, if you're really that good, there's no reason not to lift other people up.
I do recognise that. I think that seems to be one of life's truths, that the people that have got there by that route of having counsel, listening to themselves, having to have words with themselves, having to, recognising that they're far from perfect, those are the people that, generally speaking, have the capacity to engage and develop and make time for others, because they wouldn't have got to where they are without others doing it for themselves. And those are the people that seem to get fellowship and a real deep kind of admiration and an inherent respect, because they're not just focused on their own wondrousness, I guess.
But I think the other point that we could kind of integrate into it, right, is motivation. Like how much you really want it, because you go fight a guy that's there's a lot like Putin's finding out with Ukraine, right? The Ukrainians are defending their homeland. That's a whole world of different, motivation, right? And you can have the capability to do something, but do you need to do it? Do you want to do it? Because, in order to do something, spectacular, there are sacrifices to be made, and at a given point in your life, in a different context, that might make sense to you. In another, it might not, and I think actually, if you look at the debate around diversity and inclusion, this is one of the sort of the big paradoxes, because most leadership jobs are incredibly demanding, and if you've got a family and you wish to be an active participant in that family, and frankly, it doesn't make any difference if you're a man or a woman. There are some tough choices to be made, and even if you when you speak to some of the fantastic kind of female CEOs, they will be saying, I wasn't necessarily I think the PepsiCo CEO, was it Indra, kind of surname now, she would sort of on record saying I wasn't a terribly present parent, and it was only possible because actually my husband was able to support my career at a given point in time, and that might be, you might have all of the capability, but it just might not make sense to you at a given point in time. So I wouldn't underestimate the power of the underdog, or the guy that just wants it more. But capability and need and desire are separate constructs, I think.
Well, I think this is a big thing that I do hear about people that have a "I will outwork you" attitude, which is, if I can't make myself
associated with conscientiousness, by the way.
Yeah, if I just can't become cleverer, I don't mean I'm dumb. I'm good enough to play the game, but I'm just not as smart as some of the other buggers around me.
But it's a good strategy.
But I can outwork them.
Yeah, and but then that's a style of leadership, pace-setting style, and if you take direction, alignment, commitment. Commitment's important. And people will run with you for a certain degree of time, but all organisations are having something of a wellness crisis. And you don't win a marathon, right? And the corporate world, I've always said to my teams, like, this is a marathon, it ain't a sprint. You need to run at a pace you can sustain, and if you're getting divorced and your children are having issues, people sort of think of themselves. This is true of, interestingly, this is also kind of relevant from developmental psychology. So this comes from the science of cognitive development. You start off highly egocentric, right? Trump has been famously kind of badged with this. It's all about him. So your circle of who you are and what your identity is very, very, very small. And then over time, what you care about expands, right? And it might expand to include maybe your team, maybe your family, you know. But actually, what you're wanting leaders to do is to have, a commitment to the organisation. And actually, what's being demanded now of leaders by society, and then ultimately by shareholders as well, is to have an awareness of the impact on the world more broadly. Hence the rise of the sustainability movement. And what's really interesting is if you look at the kind of metadata on consciousness, and interestingly consciousness within leaders, the number of leaders of a higher level of cognitive complexity or later stages of e development is expanding. Why is it expanding? Well, why does it expand? It expands when your current way of making meaning and processing your current environment is no longer fit. It requires pressure to move from one stage to another. So kind of what you're actually seeing is the way that people are making sense of what's around them is evolving, and it's evolving because it has to. I mean, Keegan, who's a sort of Harvard professor and one of the some more prolific writers in this area, actually makes this point that perhaps human society is living longer in order to evolve into the type of consciousness that's necessary for us to survive as a planet, right? And if you look at the the types of problems that we're now wrestling with as a global society, right? So I mean, one of the things it's often talked about within development literature on an organizational or team basis is the movement between independent, which is associated with a self-authoring mind, high levels of achievement orientation, conscientiousness, sometimes called the age of conscientiousness, and interdependent, right? So if anyone's worked in an organization where teams aren't collaborating, it's a slightly dysfunctional team, people aren't thinking across the enterprise, we aren't partnering with our providers, we need to think in terms of a broader ecosystem. It's that shift. And actually, if you think about it from a global perspective, how do you solve a problem like global warming with a nation state mindset? Difficult. Nationalism isn't going to fix that.
So there's something here then about that. Being in a tribe is one thing, but being tribal is, it's good to belong. It's good to want to care.
Yeah, of course.
If it becomes protectionist, if it becomes us winning, them losing, which can happen globally, but also can happen between teams, between departments, between sectors, pans out as being an inherent truth, I guess.
I mean, at the end of the day, it's a problem if it doesn't work for you. So, and I guess that's the point. When it worked for a social group to be, competitive because there was enough resources or whatever it might be, that was fine. It's as complex as it needs to be. It's requisite for its context. But when the problem is such that you need to fix it in a broader ecosystem, then you need to have behaviors, mindsets, ways of comprehending that are congruent with that. That's kind of the point. And the very nature of the problems that organizations in plurality across many sectors, but also society are facing are interdependent in nature, and yet there are equally and Jordan Peterson's been I quite like him, really kind of outspoken on this topic. Equally, you can't be kind of like massively globalist and actually, adopt a kind of morally superior and ironically egocentric aspect to it, and then not listen to the people on the ground.
Jordan Peterson is the fella that I almost want to go what he said, as in he's obviously done the thinking on my behalf, and he's explained it in a manner that if I was that eloquent, that's what I'd have just said. So I'm a big fan.
It's clever guy.
How this manifests in the reality of the operation. We have these observations, we have these insights, we have this relative clarity or belief that comes from the learning and the academia, I guess. I suppose the question is the transfer of that into the workplace and the tolerance or the interest in an organisation going beyond just method and process to the development of the human being, because actually that means we're going to have a more rounded person, and they're getting people to connect to that if we're actually not looking at just the next 6 months, but we're looking at the next 6 years, bringing that into play.
One of the principles that I try to adopt, and like all knowledge, all this stuff is stolen with pride, right? Was the idea of I think I'll probably have to credit Keegan with this one, the deliberately developmental organisation, right? So if you're if you understand that there's a paradox between leadership emergence and where you want someone to be, right, you're just going to have to deal with that, because that's just it's there, right? And sometimes you're going to have to put people in jobs, trying to do it as little as possible that aren't 100% there. But if you can just give them a process and some support scaffolding that says you're not there yet, but this is your ladder, and here's some clarity around the things you can improve, and put in the infrastructure and the rigging, if you like, to try and make sure they're getting that feedback on a regular basis. And when I say feedback, I mean one of the factors of leadership emergence is they're very, very good at managing upwards, right? What you really want as a leader, and arguably some, in academia, some people would say the best test for leader is actually what the people that being led think, as well as the organizational outcomes are being delivered, and you can have short-term outcomes and not great leadership, and that won't work medium or long term. And that's something that I've always tried to kind of work with as much as possible. So try and get the capacity that you would like on an ideal basis. But if you haven't done that, then try and kind of get the enough quality of developmental input, and particularly in ways that's super hard for people's ego to reject, right? And that's the point, because
it's the kind of stuff that you put into that camp.
So look, I mean, psychometrics are a great starting point, because so let's take personality traits. Let's start with that, right? So if you take something like a personality trait instrument, and I sit down with you, and you can go, well, I don't agree with that. And I go, and I'll start the conversation with going, well, that's really interesting, because that's what you've said about you. That's what you said is important, because you've done this in a recruitment context. So essentially what you've done is you've not only told me what you think, you've told me what you think I want to hear, because you wanted to get the job, right? So that's one thing. I mean, I personally like tools where you don't necessarily know the right answer, because you're going to get what you're going to get, and there are qualitative techniques you can use on that to get a sense of someone's self-concept. And there's also there are different measures of ego development or cognitive complexity that you can use, as long as you pick one that's valid, and not all of them are. And then equally you can use. I'm a big fan of this 360 feedback, because again, you may think whatever you think about yourself, but if other people don't agree with you, that there's some really good material there. And I personally think a mashup of all of those things, along with kind of rigorous competency assessment, which is pretty much my kind of research design, to be honest, in academia is is your best shot at trying to really capture somebody. The problem with all that stuff is it's just expensive. But increasingly, machine learning and these types of things are making that kind of stuff cheaper. So, and I think that there's a, I think it's going to be easier to do a better job in the future, but ultimately you then also need somebody to hold the hand of that person with sufficient coaching skill to land it on them. Because if you just print out a report, it's quite easy, particularly if you don't like it, to kind of rip it up and put it in the bin. But of course, I would say that a really good leader will be really interested in where they're not good, because that's one of the things you're looking for.
Yeah, when I run programs, I'm very keen on that, the facilitator being the coach. It's not that there's not a value to external coaching for independent need, but particularly when people are on a developmental program, because I've seen you in the workshop. I've seen you for 1 or 2 days. I've seen those behaviours manifest in your interactions with other human beings and etc. I'm privy to your 360. We're having conversations about that and the psychometrics. So I do think that having that ability to not just have a conversation with you about the report, which is fantastically valuable, but actually if it's part of something where I've actually seen you in play, because otherwise I can only accept what you're telling me as being the truth.
And there's a different level of data in that, isn't there? I mean, I forget the ratios now, but I think like 60% of communications visual. And there's a whole nother layer of communication when you see the interaction of that, between individuals, and I think it's one of the things that I've been a big exponent of is you can't you have to look at the leader and team as a kind of construct.
So looking for people that might be listening to this podcast, and they could be peers of yours, they could be people in leadership roles, and they're looking forward over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years and thinking, what's the future? What's the future bringing? It's the lottery numbers I'm asking you, James. But we look into the future, which is unknown. Exactly. What should people be paying attention to, do you think, that says, look, if you're going to navigate these waters, some known, some unknown, what would you kind of advise? Not necessarily the input, but where to focus?
That's a loaded question, because of course the kind of dodge the bullet answer, which is also correct, is it kind of depends on the person and context. And it's funny, I had this debate with some of my professors, and I also had this debate with myself. Is like, well, yeah, everything's contextual, and yet there are some trends, aren't they? That we can kind of lean on. So I think, is it true to say that broadly speaking, more customer orientated organizations have better long-term outcomes? Yeah. If you have a leadership team of individuals that are results orientated, but also collaborative, and are results orientated in a way that incorporates a sophisticated understanding of a company's commercials and different ways of financial thinking, right? So are cognitively complex, not only behaviorally, but also in the financial aspects of business. Do you have people that, or do you have a sufficient mix of people that have sufficient functional and technical expertise, a task orientation and a strategic orientation? Probably one of the biggest ones, and I'm embarrassed to say I almost kind of missed it, and yet I didn't. I sort of did miss it and didn't miss it, because I was interested in the entrepreneurial personality, and I probably know less about that than I probably did, because I did less research on this. but it was incorporated within my academic studies, and the reason for that is I think Clayton Christensen termed the term disruptive innovation quite a few years ago now. Interestingly, the automotive industry was a highly disruptive innovation, and if you take the internal combustion engine, that is something called a general purpose technology, right? General purpose technologies are innovation spawning. Okay, so what they do is they take your disruptive innovation curve and they invert it. So they radically increase it, and essentially at the minute, and kind of Kathy Wood sort of does a great job of explaining this. If everyone sort of reads her stuff from ARC Innovation in the US, and that's a sort of investment fund. Did great in the sort of pandemic, and obviously bonds are up, growth's down at the minute, but I'm sure it'll invert over time. But that essentially there are multiple general purpose technologies acting on each other at the current moment in time. And if you look at most of the companies that have done that have prospered, they're all engaged in these technologies. That's why digital, artificial intelligence, robotic process automation, printing, printing on demand, as in physical printing on demand, are occurring in a period of time. So if you understand that the pace of disruption is being massively accelerated by technology at a rate we've just never seen before, the danger in having leaders that are orientated in how we did things previously, because is tremendous. So so that's arguably where curiosity becomes super important, right? Because your ability to look outside of your organization and understand how the external context is evolving, as opposed to focus on what you're doing today or did yesterday is how things should be done in the future, becomes tremendously important. I also think, if I'm honest, there's a sort of an interesting sort of paradox in there with neuroticism, right? Because you wouldn't necessarily think that oh yeah, I want to work with an emotionally unstable leader, but it might be handy to have some people out there that are focused on risk, right? And actually having a degree of neuroticism where you're focused on how this might go wrong isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? What you tend to get in leadership teams, and McKinsey wrote a great book, but you don't need the book. You just kind of need a mental image of a hockey stick, and the book is Strategy Beyond a Hockey Stick. Is within businesses, essentially, most business plans look like a hockey stick because they're poorly researched. People tend to look at the positive as opposed to the negative. It's the business plans are rich with confirmation bias, so that their euphemism, which I quite like, is what you end up with is then a hairy back, right? Which is like what actually happens to the business plan is like this, and each year we're gonna max it out, and it's because it's just wishful thinking, and they haven't factored in, the different scenarios. Okay, I get that's your best case scenario, that's your top right. Yeah, what are the other ones, and how are you actually gonna plan against those other ones? And I think a lot of organizations are realizing that when things are as unstable, when you've got kind of pandemics and all the knock-on effect of that, your ability to plan effectively is really pretty poor. And Shell worked this out a long time ago. I mean, Energy's sort of been playing this pond for a while, and scenario planning is one of the ways that get you out of that. And it's so I guess there's a long way of saying being data driven, recognizing the limitations of being data driven in a highly volatile context is probably not a bad thing to be.
So listen, I'm just super alert to time. Just anything from you that is, if somebody said, James, what book should I read? What podcast should I listen to? Anything that you go, look, it's an old faithful, but you know what? I read it 25 years ago, and I read the Leadership Challenge by Kuz and Posner, and I just always recommend it to people. I just think it's a great book, for example.
I'm not sure I've got one that I would recommend over and above all the others. So I mean, so the seven transformations of leadership on Harvard Business Review. That's on Action Logics. That's a really, really nice article. It's one of the most well read. That's a really good introduction to cognitive development over time. Equally, Keegan's work on the self authoring mind. One of my kind of irritation buttons is strategy, and I'm a big fan of good strategy, bad strategy as a book. Rumelt is the guy that wrote that. That's probably I'm not going to rattle on for ages because I could do, but yeah. And I'm going to throw in one more, which is The Neurotic Organisation by Manfred Ketz. That's another classic.
Boom. There we go. So listen, I'm going to keep you on for a few more minutes just to make sure everything loads up. But from me personally, the audience that we have, just thank you so much for your time. I think it's been invaluable. It's given an insight into you, and I think you've given some value, which I think will probably be one of those podcasts that may have to be listened to twice. So we'll see. But thank you so much.
Absolutely. Great fun, guys. I thought it might be. So always enjoyed our chats.
That's it, so I hope you enjoyed the episode. Please share so others get to hear about us, and subscribe so you keep up to date on new episodes. Also visit livingbrave.com if you want to connect with me and find out more about executive coaching, team effectiveness and changing culture. Oh, and of course you can buy my book Living Brave Leadership on Amazon. So on that note, see you soon.